What's going on, everybody? It's Carpo here, and this video, I guess, what I'm trying to encompass as far as the discussion is what exactly is innocence and what is purity, and that's a very vague question, of course. I should give you how it came to mind. I was just in the house with the kids, and my kids are in there playing their time, which is their video game time, and they have their pads, and I was just thinking about how when kids want what they want, you know, they'll sit and scream and run in their rooms and any kid in general, not just my kids. But as they get older, you teach them responsibility. You teach them that acting out and acting like a fool is not conducive to getting what they want. Of course, this is the idea. A lot of parents teach their kids the opposite. They just basically give their kids whatever they want, and then they turn into a whole generation of spoiled-ass brats that feel like they're entitled. But this is more about what exactly defines innocence, if you will. And so I'm going to start with the idea of a child. I've heard a lot of folks using the child as an example of innocence. They say, well, once the child has lost that innocence and once they've been corrupted by the modern world. So I was just in there and I was thinking about that, and I thought, so let's just say a child is innocent. What makes the child innocent? As far as, is it just because he's unaware of the world's problems? Is it because they're acting on their own true heart from their heart? And many people believe that, if we live from the heart, then we're living at our closest to nature, if you will. And there was a time when I entertained that notion, when I thought, maybe if we just follow our hearts, then we'll do a lot better than following our minds. I mean, it's just an idea. It's not like a statement or a claim. But it just seems that our hearts can lead us astray, and our minds can lead us astray. So finding a happy medium between those is the trick. So back to kids, there's the only time at which a child can appear innocent or appear, if you will, is often when they are either babies before they can say or do anything, or when they're really young and they're saying things like, "Oh, life is about love," or the world. Why can't everyone just love each other? And something like that. So if you said that as a 40, 50-year-old adult, you say, why can't we all just get along and love each other? I mean, that's people roll their eyes at that. They're like, oh, because life is complicated. But when a kid says it, people think, oh, well, why couldn't we? This kid understands it, or this kid gets it. The thing is, in order for a kid to get to the point where they can even make a statement like that, they have to be programmed by their parents and the world around them. In other words, if you were to just let a child be raised in a dark room without any love or any affection or connection to humans, they become a feral child. And we've seen feral children, and they don't exactly act pure. I wouldn't say that they're not innocent, but I would say that when we consider innocence, if you will, that's one thing. But purity, or it's a very difficult question to answer. I hope I'm covering this somewhat, because it's hard to define where I'm coming from on this, but everyone has to be programmed, and everyone has to follow some sort of a pattern in their lives in order to get to the point where they can even function. So as we get older, we have to decide between innocence and reality. For example, the idea of your kid believing in Santa Claus versus believing in the Tooth Fairy versus believing in God. What should we teach our kids as far as should we let them live in a fairyland and then boom, reality hits them, or should we just slap them with reality the minute they're able to talk? That's a parental decision, a choice. I feel like if kids are just forced into just believing everything as it is in reality and saying, no, this is life, they miss a lot. But I also believe the kid that's raised in a fairyland idea that everything he wants he can have, and that they're an ultra special snowflake, and that no matter what they'll do, it'll be okay. That's just not reality. I mean, we make mistakes in life. We go by what we see our ancestors have done for the better and for the worse, and we say, well, I mean, that's hopefully what we do. I know a lot of folks just live in their little bubble. But for me, I like to research history. I like to research, the modern world as well as the past, different parenting methods, different living methods. I like to go through and try different things in my own life to see if they work. And that will set us up for failure a lot of the time, because if you're trying on, let's just say, religions, or you're trying on groups of friends, or you're trying on hobbies, or you're trying on political preferences, in order to find one that fits, it's going to take a while. You're going to have to sort through and say, okay, I agree with this, or I don't agree with this, or this feels right, or this doesn't. But it's a time thing. You can't look back and say, oh, I should have known this when I started, is what I'm saying. A person who finally comes to a conclusion in, say, their 40s that, okay, so this is what I should believe, and this is what I think the world is all about. And then you beat yourself up over it thinking, oh, why didn't I know that when I was 20? Because if you had known it when you were 20, then by the time you got to 40, you'd be thinking about a different way to view the world. Because no one quite has it figured out. So, the Puritans, if you will, and many religious mentalities over time have tried to define what purity and innocence is. And it's obvious they've had a difficult time too. On one hand, a person would say, well, you should not have sex with anyone until you're 21, or until you're 18, or until you're married, or whatever it might be. But these are human standards that are set, right? Well, even in the religions where they talk about chastity and not having any sex or excitement before marriage, many of these groups are the same groups that married out women, girls, at 12 years old. Okay? Many religions allow people to marry at 12 or 14 years old. And I'm not saying that this is a regular practice everywhere. I'm saying historically, this happened quite a bit. And so you start to think, well, what good does it even do to wait if most kids wouldn't even be having sex at that age anyway, if that makes sense. So what we do is we fit what we consider to be proper, and we make it fit. Well, if you can't have sex till you're married, but we want to marry young, well, then we just change the way that we view a child that's old enough to conceive or bear children. That sounds kind of harsh, but it's the reality of the way a lot of extremely religious groups think. They marry very young. And I guess maybe could be along the same lines of why people, I won't even get into that argument about the military or why young soldiers get into the war. But when a young man joins the army, a young woman, whatever, says, I'm going to fight for my country and I'm going to do what's right because I believe that this is right and this is correct and I'm protecting my fellow man. But if you're out there on the field and you're killing other humans, it's very difficult to define that as purity, and it's very difficult to define that as, I guess, living in an innocent way. But we do defend that and utilize that as saying, well, it's okay because we're fighting for a country or our God. So religion really does muck up the situation, because often we're not looking at the world we're living in right now, but rather this hypothetical world that may exist beyond this world. And I think that that's damaging overall. But the reason I'm bringing it in is because many of the religious groups through history have thought that they are the pure ones, that they have it figured out what purity really is. And I don't really think that there is such a thing. In other words, purity is defined by the social norms, if you will. As far as innocence, we're all innocent, and nobody's innocent at the same time. We all make mistakes. We all screw up. The question isn't whether you haven't made mistakes. It's whether you have made an attempt to reconcile the mistakes you have made. So then we move from purity and innocence into responsibility and respect, or adulthood, what people might call. I have met some 16-year-old kids that are far more wise and interesting to be around than people in my own age group, or even those who are in their 60s, 70s. Age really has no bearing whatsoever on wisdom when it comes to what is right and wrong, if that makes sense. Age brings wisdom, but only if you're willing to allow it to seep in. I mean, if a person reads a book every week, then by the time they're 40, they're going to have a pretty wide variety of stuff that they know or claim to know. But if a person lives to be twice that age and they never do any reading, any research, they never listen to other people's opinions, and they live in a small little town in their own little reality, and every day's the same, then age doesn't bring any wisdom except for how to cope. That's one thing that anybody who is older than you, no matter how dumb they may seem, the one thing they do understand is coping. And coping methods are probably the most important thing to learn from our elders. See, they realize often that it's not just about it's not about what you know. It's not about how many things you have figured out when you're young, or what career path you take, or which God you worship, but rather how you reconcile all the different thoughts and ideas you have throughout your life. And when you look back on, oh, well, I thought this when I was younger and I was a fool. You weren't a fool. You were learning. You were experimenting. It was like building your first house, and you had no plans. You have to start somewhere. And eventually you see your mistakes. You see, okay, this is where I failed. And then you don't want to go back to that place. Say you sink into a depression or anxiety over something in life. A lot of folks will say, just fight that off, oh, it's no big deal. Take a pharmaceutical, or take this herb or this. It doesn't work that way. There are no quick answers to basic life stresses and anxiety other than to learn to cope. And so that's the wisdom that anybody with any older generation person can give us, but only if they appear to be living it. So if you're a 70-year-old grumpy man who's always yelling at the kids on the street, or you talk about what's wrong with the other races or the other cultures, or all the damn liberals or damn conservatives, then you haven't got it yet. You haven't figured it out. You haven't figured out that there is a balance between the right and left brain, and that balance is carried on into the universe. People try to define it. They want to call it duality or non-duality, the male and female energies. There are plenty of new age bullshit spiritual practices that try to claim they understand how this works, Things like the Tree of Life or the Sephiroth, with all the varieties of different connections between the chakras, or, the Yod He, Vav He, and the original pronunciations of God. And people believe that chanting certain words will bring you into tune with yourself. I've studied all these things. And the one thing that I found, the one common thread, is hope and drive. That people find something new that moves them, and they say, okay, this is great. To give you an example, I guess there was a show a few years ago that used to put out videos all the time. It wasn't this, what was it? It was that show, well, there was a guy, Patch was the name that he gave the character, and it was, all of these videos were about how to improve, or how to understand the deeper meanings of symbols and life and all this. And I fell really into it for a while. A few months I was like, wow, this is fascinating. Until I came across this video that talked about Atlantis and ancient Lemuria, and how human spirits came here from Mars, and that there was this whole historical battle between good and evil. And I was just like, okay, I guess I got to look a little deeper. Where's the evidence of this? Where are they getting this information? And find out that there is none. There really is none. All we have are these half ancient stories that are half written and translated as best we can, and we assume that these are real things that happened rather than mythological stories of deities and whatnot. And I guess what I'm getting at is humans are complicated. We're very complicated. Each one of us, no matter how much we pretend to know, is hopefully spending some time in our daily life to really think through what we believe that we think we know. I would say that the stronger your opinions are leaning one way, the more of the likelihood that you're mistaken in some way. And I could be completely wrong on many counts there. I know this because I'm not giving examples. But whether it be political, religious, or your values, or your pride, or, It's just like if you live in a tribe and you hunt your meals and you're hunters and gatherers. If you go out and you hunt all the animals in one, in 1 week and you kill them all off, you'll never be able to eat that meat in time, and then there won't be any for the future generations. If you don't go out and you don't harvest enough meat, or you're afraid to take an animal because you don't want to harm nature, then your people starve. And that's just kind of a metaphor for how I see everything in life, that you have to find a fine balance between these things. Rather than completely annihilating sugar for your diet from your diet for the rest of your life, maybe moderate it, or a person who feels like they can never, whether it be drug related, food related, or just behavior related, and of course all three of those are tied together. But we're all addicts to something, and that's because that might even be addiction to a mindset. Because it gives us comfort, it gives us grounding, it tells us that we're part of something. And I say that coming from from the point of view of a person who has no real strong beliefs, who has no real strong foundation of what I believe the universe wants from me or from anyone else, with no foundation in religion, no political affiliation. I just feel like a guy floating in space that's in my own reality. And at times that puts me in my own world, and I think, how nice would it be to be able to join in a conversation online and say, yeah, I agree with this 100%, and have an echo chamber of people telling you, yeah, what you believe is right, what you believe is right, yeah, you too, you too. And you keep feeding each other that fire until you say, yes, we know it's right, everybody else is wrong. That's what religion does. And when you look at the wars that it's caused between people based on that fear of protecting what we believe to be the correct belief system, it's a travesty. It's difficult to watch. It's difficult to see that humans aren't fighting over resources so much as we're fighting over ideas. The resources, I would say, that many are fighting over, but using religion as a catalyst or an excuse to do these things. And so, what's the point of this whole video? I guess I don't really have a specific point other than that what we consider to be right and wrong and pure really has to be dissected a lot. I've had discussed a lot of times in the past about what is right and wrong, and on those videos I've had some pretty intense discussions with people. And people just say, well, you just know when something's wrong. And they give me an example then, and they say, well, it's wrong to kill another human. And I say, okay, well, what if that human comes into your house and he's threatening to kill your family? And I had one Christian I had that very discussion with, and he said, well, I leave it in God's hands. And I say, well, I gave him that example. What if somebody was coming to harm your family, you knew that your family was going to lose their lives, and you had a gun, and you had the ability to defend yourself and your family, would you do it? And he said, no, I'd put it in God's hands. And I said, either you're an idiot or you're completely full of shit. Because if we are really the children of any God, then we have the right to protect ourselves. Look around, in other words, a person's letting one, thou shalt not kill. Because of his belief so strong in that, he's willing to let thou kill others in quantity before, anything is done about it. I'm a hard ass when it comes to that. I'm like, if somebody is a threat to society, they need to be taken care of. Do I have the judgment on how that should be done? No, of course not. I read a story about the Inuits and what they did with psychopaths. Sociopaths, psychopaths are maybe 1% to 2% of the population, are born with tendencies where they have less empathy, if you will. And in places where there's very little food, like with the Inuits up north, and I haven't never confirmed this 100%. I've read a few different articles claiming the same thing. That if somebody showed those tendencies, then when they went out with their first hunting party, because they'd go out to hunt in the snow near the coastline, and they'd walk out to a cliff and they'd push the person off the cliff. And I never once thought that sounds harsh. I thought that sounds like a way that a sacrifice humans have to make in order to protect the whole group. So today, when we see predators out there, people we consider to have bad values, we lock them up in jail. But many of these people are simply selling a joint on the corner or whatnot. We've confused what we consider to be right and wrong, And meanwhile, the monsters are completely getting away with everything because they have enough finances and enough backing to basically buy their way out of anything. I mean, and this is not a new thing. The queens and the kings of the past, some of them started with noble intentions and ended up spending all of the people's tax money on riches and, more castles, more houses. And this is the same thing that's happening today. And I used to go back to the Marie Antoinette, the beheading, as it were, that to say, well, this is what happens to, kings and queens who wrong their people. But if you really look historically, Antoinette was actually a pawn. She was blamed for all of the problems which started with the king before her. She had actually tried to help the people, but no matter what she did, her voice was obscured, and she was basically the pawn, the one that somebody's got to die. Somebody's got to lose their life, and there's always more of a story. But we want to blame the monster. We want to blame the one person when it's really the system that causes the problems. But there are some really harsh people out there that I consider to be pretty much as unpure as you can, and this is any person who is willing to sacrifice the goodwill or life or health of another person in order to put more money in their pocket. Now look, if a person's starving, this is a different story, because there are people out there in very poor countries who do horrible things to make money. Maybe they're even a hitman. Some people are out there, with their, for example, the oil fields in Nigeria, where the people can't make any money, so what they do is they hijack ships and they have their own refineries out in the middle of the woods and completely annihilate the environment. The rivers down there are just getting destroyed. Meanwhile, and they're being attacked for it, as the bad guys. Meanwhile, the companies like Shell and, Mobil, Exxon, that started these oil fields down there, have polluted 10 times more than the people ever have and are making 1,000,000 times more money. All these people are just trying to do is survive. But people would point the finger and say, look at what they're doing to their own land. You say, when people are desperate, they do desperate things. So what I'm saying is that a rich person has no excuse to do desperate things. You're not monetarily challenged, you're doing fine. And so, yes, it's not that I'm against the rich or the wealthy or the well-to-do. I think that's just the balance of society. But the way that we consider, our values to be more valid than another person's, and how people shut each other out, is just absurd. So it's really important, I think, that we look at each other with fair, rational, balanced view. At least give each other a chance, whether we're rich or poor, whether we're there's so many different classes you could fit each other into, and when you really think about it, in the end, we're all naked. Everybody's naked, sitting on their toilet taking a shit once in a while. So it's my only hope is that I can live my life with enough balance to not have to worry about whether I'm pure enough or good enough. We do need a little bit of the reflection from our fellow man, and we also need to look within too. So yes, do what you feel in your heart, but also what's reflected back at us from other people is important, and we tend to ignore that a lot. So that's my ramble for the morning. Peace and love. Talk to you later.